Well, hello everybody. Again, welcome back to another episode. In this episode, I want to take on the modern monetary theorists a bit specifically, I want to deal with Stephanie Kelton. This is her discussion with Town Hall Seattle that happened back in June 15th. It's called Stephanie Kelton, Debunking the Deficit Myth by Town Hall Seattle. Anyway, the reason I want to tackle this discussion here, and I'm only going to start at the 32-minute mark with her. It's an hour-long interview, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing because this video would end up being 2 hours or so. But I want to address some points starting with the topic right before her Q&A and also in the Q&A, because I don't want to accuse who seems, when she speaks, she seems very authentic in her understanding of things and the way she presents them, but I don't want to accuse her of being a shill for central banks. But I have a very hard time believing her or Warren Mosler, who I'll do a video on later, of being that myopic in their understanding of economics, that their policy proposals, they don't see the clear issue that they should have with their own policies. And so with that, without further ado, I am going to begin playing at the 32-minute mark.
I need to talk about one more topic, and then I would like to go open it up to Q&A. But this topic is really close to my heart because well before I started working on the book, I wrote a number of papers on Social Security. And so I have a chapter in the book where I take up Social Security, and I think it's really important, especially now, because we are already hearing now with Congress passing multi-trillion-dollar spending bills, and the deficit is increasing, the national debt is increasing, and the hand-wringing is beginning to start. And that's not good. We definitely do not want lawmakers getting anxious about the impacts of the current economic fallout and the spending bills that they've put in place so far to try to support the economy, giving them cold feet prematurely. Because if fiscal support is withdrawn prematurely, or if not enough is done, then we as a nation are going to end up with an economy that is struggling to recover. We could be looking at a period of many, many years where the unemployment rate could be stuck in double-digit territory, 10%, 12%, 15%, who knows? But we don't want Congress getting cold feet. And we're already beginning to hear things like, well, now that we've increased the deficit so much and now that the debt has increased, it's time to start thinking about entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare.
So before she gets into that point, I just want to ask one very simple question of the unemployment being 10 to 12% or more, or 20% or something like that. The question is this: why? Why is it the case that unemployment would shoot up if Congress had not enacted all these spending policies? We will address this in the back end of the discussion because she comes back to kind of this point here, but she doesn't realize that, let's put it this way, she doesn't realize the implications of her own policies and the fact that we're not new to modern monetary theory. It's basically their prescriptions have been applied since central banks have existed, spend money, and just control inflation on the back end. That's kind of the policy. We've tried to have this kind of policy throughout. So the question is, why would unemployment skyrocket like that? What would be the purpose of it? And that's where we're going to get into. I don't know exactly when in this conversation, at least on the back end, but I don't know if in midway we're going to get into the real problem with why unemployment must spike like that whenever you are using this kind of policy prescription. Anyway, let's continue.
And this is it's often argued that these are the real drivers of our long-term debt crisis. That, our short-term finances were okay before coronavirus came. Now they're much worse than they were. But in the medium and longer term, we're going to have to start making some tough choices and figuring out how we're going to change Social Security or change Medicare so that the government can spend less money, because the argument is that these programs are unaffordable. And, again, if you just go back to the first chapter and the first point I made, federal government of the United States of America is the issuer of the dollar. The issuer dollar can never run out of money. It can never have bills coming due that it can't afford to pay. So think about what that means for Social Security. Okay, Social Security is a program that provides financial benefits to not just retirees, but to their dependents in many cases, and to the disabled. So the federal government has created a program that is an automatic entitlement program, in the sense that once you qualify for the benefits, you're in the program, and the benefit payments are supposed to be made to you. There are people who believe that the federal government can't afford to keep its promises, that the system is running out of money. There are trust funds that are set up. Think of that as a sort of piggy bank or a savings account where someone has stuffed dollars in, locked them into place, with the intention of releasing them in future years to pay retirees. As our aging society, the demographics are such that workers are moving out of the workforce and into retirement, and as they go on to Social Security, we're supposed to make benefit payments to them. People say we can't afford to do it. There's not enough cash being paid into the system to allow the federal government to meet its obligations in full in perpetuity. To which I say, why would you worry about trapping dollars in a trust fund, like locking up digital spreadsheet entries and thinking that somehow that's what makes you able to meet future obligations? That if we don't tie up enough dollars, trap them on a spreadsheet somewhere, then we won't be able to mail benefit checks or send the dollars out in the future to retirees. That is obviously very silly. So the federal government can afford to keep its promise to every future retiree, their dependents and the disabled, with or without this thing called a trust fund, with or without dollars locked up digital, right? They don't even exist in physical form. We're just numbers, typed into a computer keyboard that show up in this thing we call the trust fund. The challenge is, think again about where the limits are. It's our economy's real productive capacity. It's our real resources. Inflation is the thing to worry about. So if we're looking into the future and we see the demographic changes taking place, we say the U.S. workforce is shrinking because we're an aging society. People are moving out of the workforce and into retirement. Once they retire, they're no longer working and producing goods and services, but they still consume goods and services, so they want to buy some of what's produced. The question then becomes, if we keep our promises, if the government keeps its promise to all future beneficiaries, sends those checks out, will people who receive those benefit payments be able to turn around and spend that money back into the economy without creating undue inflationary pressure, unwanted accelerating inflation? That's the risk to manage. It's not we won't be able to afford to keep promises. Of course we can afford to keep promises. The question is, and this is what politicians really should be wrestling. If they want to have a fight, have a good fight, have a meaningful fight, right? Figure out who's got the best ideas for the kinds of investments that we need to make in our economy today to make sure that in 10, 20, 30 years, the U.S. economy is productive enough that when those benefit payments go out, we are able to produce enough stuff, right, the goods and services, so that the working population and the retired population can all spend money into an economy where it's able to keep up with that demand, where there's enough productive capacity, enough supply, so that we can have a full employment economy. Everybody gets the output that they want. It can be produced without inflationary pressure. So, if I had to say in a nutshell, and I want to wind up so we can do Q&A, what is the point of MMT? MMT is about replacing artificial, phony constraints with a real resource constraint. which is an inflation constraint. And by the way, and it's also in the book, a real, a natural resource constraint, right? An ecological constraint, economic constraint, that we can't place excessive pressures on our factories and machines and on our planet and expect things to work out well for us. So it's about getting away from an obsession with the stuff that doesn't matter and turning our attention to the things that do matter. And so chapter 10, I didn't write 10 chapters, I wrote 8. Chapter 7 is called The Deficits That Matter. And that's where I really hope that we can start turning more of our attention to the legitimate deficits that are pervasive in our economy. So with that...
So, thank goodness she's finally done after 4 minutes. So, that long-winded response was to say this, that the only constraint on meeting obligations is inflation. So really, that response is basically to people who are of the Republican side of the aisle who say the federal government can't afford to, meet its own obligations or whatnot to the people. And it's not to say that they're going to run out of money. And I don't know very many people that actually have this opinion or have this actual belief or understanding of monetary policy that they're going to run out of money. But instead, that they're going to have two options. They're going to have the option of taxing or monetizing the debt, which means they're going to print money. And that's the inflation factor. Okay, but there is the taxation factor, which she also, also part of modern monetary theory assumes that taxation is always a viable option to curb inflation. I mean, that's kind of the assumption there, is that if inflation gets too bad, they can tax. And they assume that they can get away with the taxation in the first place. This is where I can't, it boggles my mind that they can be so myopic on this issue. I mean, she's right about the fact that inflation is a real resource constraint. Absolutely. I would 100% wholeheartedly agree with that. It's a natural resource constraint. It's ecological in nature. That's absolutely true. But the idea that taxation is always going to be available to curb that inflation is, I think, an asinine proposition. But just for the sake of clarity, for all governments, now keep in mind the United States is in the unique position right now, maybe not at the end of 2021, but right now, of being the world's reserve currency. And what that means is, no matter what, we can print as much money as we want. As the United States, we can print as much money as we want. It's the world's reserve currency. So we can force people to use it. We can force people to accept the dollar because enough people will, or enough countries will. And there's a limit. One of the constraints of printing our own money, though, is that there are nations that don't like us, that do use the dollar, but would, if alternatives existed, they would switch to something alternative. We'll get into that in a little bit, but keep in mind, the Weimar Republic could have met its obligations as well. It met its obligations up until the point that printing money was slower than the inflation rate itself. So, I mean, eventually people just gave up on using the dollar, or using the Weimar mark, or whatever it's called. I don't know what the actual currency was called. Zimbabwe as well, where you had 1 trillion% inflation or something like that. People eventually just gave up on using it. So it could have printed $1 trillion coin to cover its obligations, absolutely. But you understand, as a thinking individual, you understand that that's freaking stupid. And so here, it's the same story. Is what do we do about inflation? Let's continue.
I think I will stop and look to take some of the questions that you all have submitted. Let me give a quick look here. Well, Jeff asks, how can the American public be educated about MMT to build political support? I think that's a great question, Jeff. And I'm not an organizer, but I know a lot of good ones, and I know how important that work is. I think that it has to be a multifaceted effort. It can't be, we're not going to spread a better understanding, I said spread, bad word. We're not going to achieve a better understanding, better public discourse without, journalists playing an important role. They're the ones who sit down with politicians, and if the first question out of their mouth is, how are you going to pay for it? And then haranguing them over the numbers and whether the math adds up and whether it will add to the deficit, that's not helpful. We need journalists to start asking better questions. So if somebody says, I want Medicare for all, don't say, how are you going to pay for it? Say, well, are you sure we have the doctors and nurses, the long-term care facilities? Will we have the mental health professionals? Will we have the hospital beds? Will we have the infrastructure, the real resources to produce and to make good on that promise of Medicare for all, or whatever the case may be, tuition-free college, right? You have to have people on the ground. You have to have, I think, people like me. We have to teach better, and we have to teach each other, and we have to have discourse on a whole bunch of different fronts. So I like that question a lot. It's not easy to get there. I'm doing my part.
The answer, of course, to that question is, what do you mean how we're going to pay for it? We're just going to print the money. And, if inflation is a consequence, then we'll deal with the inflation via taxation. That's the answer. So then it's basically, let's just skip that question. I mean, it is skipping the question of how do you know that taxation is going to be a viable solution? Anyways, let's continue.
How much debt is too much is one of the questions, and how do we know when we get there? So I didn't get to spend a lot of time on any one subject, but on the debt, the debt is just a misnomer in some respects. It's got a rotten calling card, and I say this in the book, because people think, well, there's too much debt, and this is what this question is about. The national debt, this thing we call the national debt, is nothing more than a historic record of all the past instances where the government spent more money, more dollars into the economy than it taxed back out, and those dollars are currently sitting in the form of U.S. treasuries, government securities. If that's the name we've given to it, sucks, frankly. We call it the national debt, and it's just a stockpile of treasury securities that you could think of as part of the U.S. net money supply. You can just think of it as part of the money supply. Part of our money supply is interest-bearing, and part of it is non-interest-bearing. Treasuries are interest-bearing dollars. So if the question is, how many interest-bearing dollars are too many interest-bearing dollars, then my answer is, well, it depends. Are they creating any kind of problem? Okay? Are they creating inflationary pressures? If you've got interest-bearing dollars out there and somebody's being paid interest income, I'm a bondholder, right? So suppose I have bonds. And because I hold bonds, I'm being paid interest income. And that interest income then allows me to spend more, right? So if all of the bondholders are getting all of this interest income, and those dollars start going out and chasing goods and services, and the economy's productive capacity is already at its maximum, then you could get inflationary pressures. So the answer to the question, how much debt is too much, is when the debt becomes a problem is when it starts to give rise to inflationary pressures.
No. Okay. Sure, if, in the theory of if production is at maximum capacity and we start printing more money and stuff and, issuing treasury securities, and we start putting that out, that's going to cause issues of, inflationary pressure. That's not true. No. The actual problem is this. When the government spends money, how does it know what to spend money on? How does it know that the productive capacities that it's spending money on in an economy or whatnot are actually the most efficient uses of that resource. Because, presumably, let's think about 2008, right? Certainly we did have inflation. If you don't think we had inflation in 2008, you're just not looking. The inflation was in the stock market. That's where it started. Inflation was in the stock market, where when it collapsed, they printed money, and then you can see in lockstep with money printing, the stock market just rises and rises and rises. Can you guess where inflation was again? Again, in the COVID period, inflation was also in the stock market and also in gold, where gold ratcheted up to at least over $100 an ounce, which was at least over 5% increase just within a few months, just in the price of gold. So, and you see that gold also was ratcheted up after 2008. I think it's going to do it again, but we'll wait to see what happens. But then, what that means for future buyers is that there's the assumption, whenever you're paying a high price for a stock, assuming that you're looking for a certain return, there's an assumption there that the earnings will cover the price that you're paying. So if you're paying for a stock that has a high price, you're really talking about the price per share, and you're also talking about the if it has a price to earnings ratio that's fairly high, you're talking about a lower return on your investment. And so, you're facing inflationary pressure in that arena as well. So if you're, a young 20-something in 2008, when the stock market collapsed like I was, you're kind of screwed. Unless you got in at the ground floor, which you probably didn't have the capital saved up to buy in. You probably didn't have the credit history to get capital to buy into the market that was significant enough. You're screwed, because the market's going to go right back up. And yeah, it'll post highs today and next week and stuff. But then your quote-unquote COVID happens. Your markets, we already knew that the market was going to crash again anyway. In September 2019, I did a video on that called Collapse of Virus. And what that means is your stock market's going to go up, but you have no capital saved up. So any money you put in now is most likely going to be a loser long term. It's going to have a low return on investment. There will probably be better investment alternatives, of which gold would have kicked the stock market's butt the last 10 years. But that's neither here nor there in this discussion. But the inflationary pressure is money printing in general. It's not to do with just productive capacity and such. The historic definition of inflation was money printing. What also happens whenever government spends money is, think of this analogy, or think of this example. If the government decides to just print $1 trillion today and put it all in the military, building bombs that are going to sit in bunkers for the next 30 years, do you think that there's going to be inflationary pressure? Well, yeah, you bet you. There's more dollars out there. They took it from you, basically, whenever they printed the money to pay for it. They took it from your dollars that you're currently holding. That's why the wealthy don't hold dollars. The other thing is that, as far as iron or whatever materials go into producing a bomb, like iron, energy, resources and such, those things are pushed up as well in prices because of increased demand. So, as a consequence, you're paying a higher price for the energy that you need to use for your day-to-day because of the spending that the military has done. And here's the other question. Does that mean that bomb making or military or joining the military is a good career choice in the long term? Well, we don't know. It's paid for by government revenues, or I should say, quote unquote, government revenues and such. It's paid for ultimately by that, but that's assuming that they don't money print. But whenever, say, the government backs Tesla, do we know that energy is really a good, or that electricity is really a good energy source or something like that? Do we know that batteries are a good alternative fuel source? I mean, do we know these kind of things? Well, no. What ends up happening, though, is that the government spends a lot of money, and what happens is that the structure of production changes over time. Keep in mind, we're already in the middle of that with the government having already spent money. So we have to assume our structure of production, for her scenario to be right, we have to assume that the structure of production has to be fairly efficient. And we don't know that. In fact, I can guarantee you we know it's not. And how do we know? Well, public schooling. I mean, COVID is showing us that public schooling could have been done at home for the most part. It could have been done at home. And if you did it as a video session instead of as a live session, well, you have a whole lot less teachers that you actually need on staff. And that's a whole lot less spending by the government that needs to be done. And you're also talking about not having, or, for kids who are learning that way, you're also taking the best lectures and you're recording them, and then those are the ones that go to the classroom. And it's the same every single year when they teach that lesson. Maybe the technology gets a little better to convey information a little better. But, I mean, if that beats a teacher who might have had a bad night, who's tired the next morning because maybe her kid didn't sleep or something like that. Or maybe stayed up a little too late or something like that watching, Orange is the New Black or something like that. And so the next day, the kids don't get as good of a quality education either. But yet that teacher's still making a pension, and she's getting a fairly high salary compared to private education. We know, basically as an example, we know that the government is overpaying teachers in the public school system. We understand this. We understand that the cost per child is more expensive in the public school system than it is in the private. Or in the charter as well. So the question of whether or not government spends money and it ultimately goes into efficient structures of production, I mean, I don't see any reason to believe that. Anyway, let's continue.
And that's how you know when you get there, and you can manage.
Oh, and I should say, if the structures of production are not efficient, what that ultimately means is, as time goes on, those things will be outcompeted. And what it ultimately means is that those things based on profits and losses, those things need to go away. They need to vanish. But I'm sorry, 10 years ago the government invested money into a company that really shouldn't have existed in the first place. But because it did, and thousands of people are employed by it, well, Junior over here just graduated is about to graduate high school, and he goes, what's a good career path for me? And he bases his career on the idea that job's going to still be there. And he goes into a career of doing a job that, if the government weren't subsidizing it, it wouldn't exist in the first place. I mean, these are real costs to people that our government programs, because we think our bureaucrats know best, these are real scenarios that people face. Where I come from, they would have worked at the Army Depot. The Army Depot shouldn't be there anymore, quite frankly, but it is. So, anyway, let's continue.
Manage that, okay? Please elaborate on how the pandemic response of funding, the question jumped. The elites and corporations, 4 or 5 trillion, exposes the lie that deficits even matter. Okay, so that's a good question. So here's what happened, and I know the person who asked the question knows, but just for everybody else to make sure we're all on the same page. We just, not too long ago, got through 2019, and for pretty much the whole of that year, we watched a very crowded field of Democratic hopefuls, presidential hopefuls, pitching their platforms and saying, vote for me, I'd like to be president, and these are the things I would like to do. And at every turn, the question that dogged candidates, those with more ambitious platforms really got it, right? But everybody got it, was how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay? Where's the money going to come from? How are you going to finance this stuff? And people twisted themselves in knots to try to say, well, we can find revenue here and we can raise taxes there, and we can come up with all the money we need. And then roll the clock forward to March of this year, and the coronavirus pandemic begins. And all of a sudden, dollars are materializing out of Congress, legislation is being passed left and right. Nobody paused for a second to say, how are we going to pay for it? Whose taxes have to go up? Where is the money going to come from? Congress wrote and passed bills left and right in very short order. And I think what this question from David is about is, doesn't that just expose what a farce this whole pay-for game was all through 2019, listening to this question about how there's no money for anything, can't afford to do any of these things, and now Congress is authorizing trillions, and the House has passed a bill for another $3 trillion, which the Senate has yet to show an appetite for. But the point is, we can very quickly come up with 4, 5, 6, and more trillion. And is that, in some sense, vindication of the sort of stuff I've been talking about? That's the question here. And I think the answer is yes. I think it's a very good, real-world, real-time example of exactly how Congress can and does pay for things when they deem there to be a sufficiently urgent need. Okay, if there's a priority, they will fund it. If they're not funding something, it's not because there's no money. It's because they've decided it's not a sufficiently high priority. Okay, just don't want to fund it.
Well, this question ignores, well, let's see real quick.
Please talk about the ideology of deficit.
Okay, so that question or that answer ignored the inflationary aspects of bailing of these bailouts. Yeah, nobody questioned, hey, we need to bail these things out because we're about to face high unemployment and such. But that's because politicians only give a shit about their term, their constituents, and their vote. That's all they care about. They don't care about. They don't care about Joe Dirt in Texas or anything like that. They don't. It's not something someone that they actually care about. They're just trying to stay elected because they get nice salaries. But did it cause inflation? Well, the stock market's hitting new highs, for God's sake. Of course it caused inflation. And again, the question really, I should say, the modern monetary theory requires efficient use of that money by going into efficient structures of production. Well, here's the problem. The U.S. government bailed out churches during the coronavirus pandemic. Churches. Now, personally, I'm a religious man, but at the same time, I'm sure many a modern monetary theorist and many a socialist I know for sure are not religious. And so my question to you is that an efficient use of the money? Do you want to at the end of the day pay taxes on that money? If they have to control inflation and stuff like that, do you want to pay taxes on the money that went to churches? No, you'd rather it just didn't, right? But why? Why would you rather it not? Oh, because it really passes on real costs to you. Or to someone down the line. Who knows? So, at its outset, you're already understanding that, hell, I'm paying for shit I don't even want to pay for. And you have a problem with that. But it's also the same thing of, what if churches go away one day? What if people quit believing in Christianity or something like that? What if people become atheists and stuff? Would you not consider that a poor or an inefficient structure of production? Because I certainly would. It would make no sense to say otherwise. Anyway, these are the kind of thoughts that if at the end of the day, if you're being honest with yourself, you understand that there's something funny going on. The whole story is not that we just print money. No, there's another reason why we hold off on printing money, and it's not because of it not being a pressing need. It's not a pressing need because the problems it's going to cause later are greater than the needs now. That's what it means by pressing need. So then the next question is just that you need to just consider is, are they spending it efficiently? And I mean, if you think that bailing out churches is an efficient spending, I mean, that's on you. I don't know how you're a socialist who believes that, but perhaps you do.
I think I might have hit that one, Martha, throughout. Let's see. What is the need? Okay, here's one. What's the need, if any, of having federal income taxation under MMT? So if what I've been saying is that the government is the issuer of the currency, doesn't need to get the dollar from anyone else in order to spend, doesn't rely on tax revenue, doesn't rely on savers to finance borrowing, deficit spending, then what's the purpose of taxes? Why do we even have them? So this is more than I can do in the time that remains, but in the book I go through this in a lot of detail. But one thing clearly is that if the government was simply authorizing spending bills and suspending taxes, like I'm not going to tax anything back, I'm only going to spend dollars into the economy, we'd pretty quickly run up against that inflation constraint, right? So the spending creates new dollars. Every time the government spends a dollar, it is new money creation. Those dollars are newly created, digitally minted dollars. And when the government taxes, it's retiring those dollars, okay? So the question is about the push and the pull. Okay? How many are we pushing into the economy, and how many are being pulled back out of the economy? You need to pull something back out, and that's for preventing accelerating inflationary pressure. How many need to be pulled back out? That's a function of the demand leakages that I talked about earlier. I know it seems like it would be really nice for all of us if we just didn't have to pay income taxes at all, but it does help not just manage inflationary pressures, but because of the progressivity of our income tax system, it also helps, but not enough, I would argue, with preventing the distribution of income from being even more extreme than what it already is today.
That's also just as a point of just making sure that we are keeping fairly good fairly good definitions on it, or I don't know, fairly good discussion of it. Why don't they just order everybody to set fire to say $5 each instead of taxing? Why not just make them destroy the currency? Why not? It doesn't make any sense. So I mean, you can shorten the money. You can slow the money supply down if you just burn the money. That's certainly a viable option. The other assumption that works here is that the rich hold very little in the way of dollars, because why would you hold a currency that people are actively devaluing, which is what Federal Reserve is doing when they print money in the first place. So they hold very little in the form of dollars. So when they consider that they can just tax the money away to take dollars out of circulation, what they're saying is that they can just impose a tax on the rich. But at any given time, the rich do not hold dollars. There are not very many, not enough to satisfy the demands of taxation. Instead, they hold assets. And as she said, as I believe she said earlier in the video, is that, and this is what Paul Krugman would also argue, is the dollar has value because we tax in it. Effectively, millionaires have to sell assets to generate money that they're going to use to pay their taxes. That's the effective way that they go about converting to or holding dollars, is that they're just using it as a pass through to pay their tax bill. But then there comes the day where taxation gets unreasonable, And in some circumstances, they find assets, they trade out to other assets. That way, they leave this economy, or they leave that, that ability. I think that's the kicker for Bitcoin, or at least for crypto, eventually, is the anonymity of it all. You'll disappear. And then the tax bill will just be passed on to people who hold dollars. And unfortunately, the people that are going to hold the dollars are going to be people like you and me. And the government's going to have this assumption in the future that those dollars will exist. It also assumes, because, the question would be like more of an income tax and a wealth tax, and particularly it would be an income tax, is that the rich will have a high income, which they won't. Then they'll switch to a wealth tax. And then there's a question of whether or not wealth actually exists. Like, as for some people, it's a matter of wealth, that the net worth that you see of an individual is on paper is not what the net worth, or not the actual money that an individual holds. And at any time, it can just devalue just based on economic circumstances. And since tax codes are written in nominal terms, who knows if somebody's going to be in this bracket or that bracket the next year? We don't know. So these are kind of the things that we are unaware of in the future that we're going to have to pay for as far as curbing inflation goes. Anyway, let's continue.
Yeah, so there's a question about climate change, and it jumps too because y'all are typing and then things kind of skip upwards. How can MMT function, Lina asks, alongside or contribute to calls to pursue degrowth or, a-growth in response to growth-associated climate change? I spend a lot of time in the book on climate change, in the chapter called The Deficits That Matter, and in the closing chapter to the book. I think this is critically important. Climate change is an existential threat. That is my position. So I think it has to be dealt with. When I talk about the economy's productive capacity, remember I'm also talking about the climate's capacity to handle it. The goal of MMT is not to maximize growth. It is, in fact, I think that so much of the growth obsession is bound up in the debt obsession, because people often think that the way to get yourself out of a debt problem, if you think that debt is a problem, which I don't, if you think that debt is a problem, people often say, well, the way to deal with it is to grow your way out of debt. See, and so they look at a ratio where the debt is in the numerator and GDP is in the denominator. So it's the debt to GDP ratio. And if you want to bring the ratio down, you just juice the denominator. You grow your economy as fast as you can so that the ratio will come down. And then people say, oh, we're growing our way out of debt. But if you don't view the debt as some sort of existential threat, then you can let go of that growth obsession, because you don't view growth as the solution to your debt crisis. And you can start recognizing, I think, which is what Lina's asking about, that we can function perfectly well with low growth or degrowth and have a healthy, habitable, thriving economy and planet and society. So anyway, it's dealt with in much more detail in the book. What metaphors? That's an interesting question, and I don't see the name of the person, but what metaphors will help us understand modern money, and what old metaphors should we jettison? But I think communication is key. I really do. I think framing matters a lot. I think that a lot of the damage that's been done to all of us is accomplished through clever turn of phrase, through framing. When people say the debt is going to, you're stealing from your children and grandchildren. And that's framing. Those are metaphors, okay? Borrowing from China. Those are little phrases that very quickly tap into our insecurities about, the outside world, or fear of hurting our children and grandchildren or something like that. So I try in the book to introduce different framing, new metaphors. One of my favorites, I think, is trying to say that, the goal should not be to force your economy to balance your budget, but instead to use the budget to balance your economy. And so there's a figure in the book where I show the scales, sort of like the scales of justice, the scales, and government spending is heavier than taxes, so you have the government running a deficit, but your economy is in balance. You have full employment and you have stable prices. So I want to call this a balanced budget because it delivers the economic outcome, the balanced economy that I think we should be after. So I'm always playing with this because I think it really does matter, and helping to give politicians new and more constructive ways to carry on discourse about government finances.
So, I mean, when you're talking about the effects of your monetary policy, like consider 2008, when you're talking about the effects of your monetary policy boosting the stock market back up, only to see it crash, back in March. And the idea that, for the longest time during that period, 5 stocks were basically the only leaders of that entire stock market. That was, basically they carried the weight for all the other companies in the stock market. When you're talking about boosting up price to earnings ratios by your monetary policy, you're talking about inflating the stock market. And for anybody like me who was in my early 20s, whenever that happened, then when you got in, if you did not have capital, the only time you could really get into the stock market by that point, you're in your early 20s, you don't really have capital built up and stuff. Maybe by your mid 20s, you start really kind of building some capital to put up in the stock market or something. You're buying at high price to earning ratios. And as a consequence, if those are not natural rates, then eventually they're gonna reset to natural rates. You're paying for a very volatile market, paying higher prices for a very volatile market, and that's what you're seeing. And therefore, because my parents or whatever Generation Y wanted to get bailed out, and my parents are their baby boomers, not Generation Y, but when Generation Y wanted to get bailed out on their bad bets in the stock markets, well, they got bailed out. And what is the future expense of that? Well, the future is that here I am in my early 20s when I'm supposed to be building up wealth, so that way by the time I'm 40 I can really kind of look at what real savings looks like, something like that. Instead, I'm buying at high prices that are bound to fall, or at least get meager returns on investment for a high volatility, which is what we're seeing. We saw in March. Oh yeah, there it came. Or we're going to see it again this year probably. And as a consequence, that's a very real scenario that I am the child who's going to pay for my parents' mistakes. Or I'm going to pay for the bailout of my parents. How am I going to pay for it? Well, I'm paying for it with the fact that I can't build wealth. It's very hard to build wealth just by investing in the stock market because nobody wants to touch this stuff. And if they somehow still manage to bail me out, let's hope that this monetary regime. I'm speaking facetiously here. Let's hope the monetary regime doesn't falter during my generation. Then, when they do eventually falter, which will happen at least by the next generation, they're going to foot the bill of it. The in-between's going to foot the bill of it because they're not going to get, or they're not looking at getting great returns and great prospects for retirement. So there is a very real sense. There's no sense in changing the metaphor. Yeah, in the very real sense, your grandkids are going to pay for your bailouts. That's how it happens. Because you don't realize the inflationary pressures that are being set in motion, because you don't realize, like Stephanie Kelton here, doesn't realize she's screwing with the structure of production. That's what she's screwing with. Just like overpaying teachers for a public education system, or the fact that, like, look at it again. You go to public education for 13 years of your life, only to have to go foot the bill for an expensive, and everybody agrees college is expensive and overpriced, education for the next 4 years, if you're lucky. Most likely you're going to go for the next 6 years. It's unbelievable that people still agree with this train of thought that, oh yeah, we can just print our way out of, any problems that we have and just tax it later. It's just not true. And besides, if you do want to tax, well, guess what you're going to face if you're the politician who tries to instill a tax? Because you're taxing for the fact that, your mom, who was this former senator of California or whatever, your mom decided to implement, policies that you're going to have to pay taxes for now, or that you're going to force taxes on the people for. You're the one that's not going to make it in Congress. Because politicians are naturally short-sighted. And it's perfectly natural to be short-sighted. Not saying it's right, but it is perfectly natural. Perfectly understandable. Anyway, let's continue.
I'm not sure I understand that question. If the Fed uses unemployment as a measure for inflation, it jumped again, doggone it. I started to read and then it jumped. I don't know what the question was. I'm so sorry. It popped out of view. There it is. Wouldn't a guaranteed okay, if the Fed uses unemployment as a measure for inflation, wouldn't a guaranteed livable income have kept inflation at a healthy percentage? So the Fed maintains a certain amount of slack in the labor market. This is how they would describe it. And that a certain number of people are kept unemployed for the sake of preventing the labor market from getting too tight. And the idea is when it becomes too easy for people to find jobs, when the labor market gets too tight, workers have more bargaining power, they can negotiate higher wages, and if wages increase, then employers might respond to the increased wages by raising prices to protect the profit margins. And so higher wages push prices higher, and then you get inflation, and then you can even have a wage price spiral if the bargaining intensifies. So the question is, could you somehow avoid that? Remember, we don't have inflation accelerating. Could you avoid that with a guaranteed livable income? I assume this person's asking about something like a universal basic income or something like that. There are proposals right now to get cash payments to virtually everybody in the country. And given the slack conditions in the economy, there is scope. There is definitely capacity to do some of that. I would have to know more about how much and for whom and under what conditions, but the MMT preferred way to handle unemployment is more targeted, right? So that the dollars go not to everyone in a blanket, not targeted fashion, but that you target the spending directly to the unemployed. Get the dollars in the hands of people who are looking for jobs but locked out of employment, and employ them, put them to work doing socially useful things that enhance the community, enhance the planet, caring for people, caring for the planet, caring for our communities. So none of us, I think, are opposed to some form of basic income support, especially for those who can't or shouldn't be in the workplace. And that could include some home care work as well.
So this definition of socially useful, don't be fooled. It's not well defined. They don't know what it actually means. They don't know what it's actually going to look like on the back end. They have no idea. Yeah, I mean, it sounds great to plant trees in someone's yard. Yeah, absolutely. It does. It sounds great until you plant a maple tree that's dropping acorns everywhere that are growing like crazy. And then it doesn't sound great to have planted a tree and then every week you got to go dig up roots from that maple tree. And if you let one go too long, well, you're going to have to send out the big guns to go dig it up with their gasoline-powered machines and pull it out. It sounds great. Sounds great until that maple tree grows taller than your house and then has a 200-pound branch ready to fall down onto your home. That sounds great and all, to plant trees, but you're not looking at the consequences of what potential adverse effects could be the result. Now, I'm not saying that we know that there are adverse effects. I'm not saying that we know what they are. I'm not such an idiot to make these policy prescriptions. That's why I'm not giving you policy prescriptions. I'm telling you, these are the things you're not considering. And these are the things that can't be known until it's already too late. And that's why whenever you decide that, oh hey, inflation's getting out of control, let's start taxing the populace, they ignore the idea that you're going to get thrown out of office by people who don't want you in office for taxing them. It's just how it is. They're already pissed off by the fact that they're having to pay more. Now they're going to be pissed off by the fact you're taxing more. I mean, honestly, it's asinine. So let's continue, and then I'll finish up with my final point.
So I think with that, it's 10 o'clock, and...
Okay, so she's done. Now, concerning the fact that inflation is a natural resource constraint, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. But it is also constrained by the fact that there are market prices that exist for every commodity or for every good and service that's not necessarily considered a natural resource. Or at least we don't see how that is, worked. Now, just really quick, and now I got two scenarios here for you to think about. One is the public school education system. We know now, thanks to COVID, that we've been overpaying teachers for decades. Not to mention, I think it's a stupid idea to put kids in school for 8 hours a day in a Prussian system. I think that's freaking retarded. But for, let's say, for going forward in the education system, it clearly can be done online. I think it could be done completely virtual. I think most of your education could be done in 3 hours a day. Most kids' education can be done 3 hours a day, and then you let them do their hobby. That's where you're going to get most of your education in life anyway. And it can be pre-recorded videos, and there'd be massive unemployment of these teachers. And why is there massive unemployment of these teachers? Well, the massive unemployment, the 10 to 12% that she's talking about earlier, is because of the bad creation of the structure of production that was led by and sustained by government policy that said public education is a social necessity, so we need to pay for it. So people got their careers in education, or they got their degrees in education, and sure, they got that stuff paid for free, a lot of them, but a lot of them didn't. But the fact still remains that they go into a public school, to work and stuff, and then their job's not going to be there in 20 years because they've been, by circumstances such as COVID, quote unquote, their job's not there anymore. And that's where your 10 to 12% inflation, or your 10 to 12% unemployment rate comes from. Is because it speaks to, and this is where the Austrians come in and say you would avoid these kind of business cycles or these massive unemployment layoffs and stuff like that, because markets would have already known. Markets would have already moved years ago to online education if there were no regulations in place against it. But as budget constraints happen with the federal government, or I guess in monetary theory, you can't have those kind of things. But they print money, and then it screws over other people who then get pissed off at a regime that just prints money willy-nilly. You're going to start seeing these kind of gears just grind to a halt, and they're going to demand that these things change. And one of the casualties, or one of the collateral damages of that, is going to be the public education system. I'm happy with it, because I think it means better education for my kids than what I got. I think it's more streamlined. I think it's it's going to be more geared towards their interests as well. So I'm totally cool with that. But I mean, the overall constraint is not that you just print money and then you control inflation in the back end. No, the constraint is also that you need to understand inflation happens asymmetrically throughout an economy. And those in the wise actually know this and they profit off of it. But because inflation happens asymmetrically in economies, it might be too late. You might have already realized, oh, this is inflationary, and as a consequence, your structure of production is already screwed up, and now you're going to have to face 10 to 12% of massive unemployment, or you're going to sustain the same inefficient system. Now, that's the point on the teachers. The last point I want to make is this. Okay, so let's assume for a moment that, sure, natural resources are the only constraint, and that those are the inflationary constraints that we face in an economy. Okay, so if someone, considering that the United States is a military hegemony and has been for decades, let's say that there's a popular economics idea that comes about because somebody like Stephanie Kelton says, hey, we need to watch inflation now because oil is becoming scarce, or cheap oil is becoming scarce. Let's put it that way. What do you think the U.S. is going to do? Well, my guess is a military hegemony is going to go and conquer oil fields when it becomes economically efficient too. They're going to use their military, and they're going to use the fact that it's fairly cheap for them because they're already ubiquitous everywhere in the globe. They're going to go conquer an oil field. They're going to go take it from another country. They're going to kill people over it. How would they accomplish this? Well, they might look for a new Pearl Harbor as a catalyst to do this. So, say someone starts speaking about peak oil in 1997 or something like that, and then they draw a plan saying, hey, what are we going to do about this whole cheap or this whole oil constraint, this inflationary pressure that's going to happen and stuff that's going to really impact our U.S. economy? What might we do about it? Well, who knows? We may invade places that have a lot of oil, to overthrow their leadership and install our dictators, or install our people that will do our bidding. That might be what we do. Does MMT give a shit about that? All right, that's enough. Take care, guys.